Hello and welcome back to my channel, Rosie Sews Modern Vintage. I'm Rosie and I'm so pleased to have you here today. What we're going to be looking at today is ways that you can use your sewing skills to create your vintage style wardrobe without having to source extremely rare and expensive vintage patterns which may not always be available in your size. Now, my first point that I want to make is that if you are a lover of vintage but you're not desperate to follow one particular era, perhaps you love when the full skirts first came in like 1949 through to the early 50s, if you really love that look, then understandably you're going to have a very specific idea in your mind of what you want to sew. However, if you're just a lover of all things vintage and you fancy just creating a few pieces in your wardrobe that you can use when you want to create something vintage, then my biggest suggestion is to look at the modern pattern companies but be open-minded. So just think sideways when you see a pattern. For instance, I've got one here to show you. These are the Hero trousers by Sew Me Something. So they're very simple design. They're I think they call them 7/8 length trousers, so they're just a little bit cropped, although you could make them full length if you wanted to, fitted with just a very simple pocket at the top. Now, these are not marketed as a vintage style pattern. They're not marketed for people who dress vintage. They're simply designed by the lovely Jules at Sew Me Something. However, if you have a look in places like Pinterest, when you see photographs of film stars from the 50s and 60s, perhaps Audrey Hepburn as an example, or Grace Kelly, they often wore that style of trouser. So I have got this pattern so that I can create them for a vintage inspired outfit. But again, if I'd searched vintage trouser pattern, I would not have found that online. Another example of this is the Tilly and the Buttons Cocoa top and dress pattern. Again, this isn't marketed as a vintage pattern. She just talks about how it's got a classic design feature of the boat neck. If you look at photographs taken of film stars and even just everyday people in the 60s, you will know that this funnel neck design is very typical of the 60s and perfect actually to go with a pair of these trousers. If I'd have googled vintage funnel neck, I would not have come up with this sewing pattern. So it's about being open-minded, having a look at the pattern companies that are out there and seeing what the silhouettes are of their clothes. Another place that I've found sewing patterns have been the reproduction ranges from big pattern companies like Simplicity. So I've got a couple here to show you. This one, Simplicity 8447, it's actually a 1940s vintage pattern. That would have been the original pattern sleeve, and then this is their new photographs to go with it. And so what they've done is they've recreated the silhouette and used all the original pattern pieces, but they have changed the sizing for more modern sizing, because previously in the 40s women would have had small waists, big hips, and or bigger hips compared to their waist, and everything was made very much for an hourglass figure. We aren't like that in the 21st century, and Simplicity know that. So they've changed the pattern slightly to accommodate our sizing. And of course it's multi-size, which you wouldn't have got in the 1940s. So that's a good example. And also this one, this is a 1950s vintage pattern. That's the original pattern sleeve, and this is the modern photographs that go with it. And again, they've altered that for the 21st century woman. So yeah, Simplicity, although I don't use a lot of Simplicity patterns, I do actually think that their reproduction ranges are amazing, and I've got about 10 of their reproduction patterns that I'm working my way through. Another thing to do is to think about the fabric choice. So for instance, if we look at this Tilly and the Buttons pattern, if I did this in some crazy floral print, don't get me wrong, I do love floral prints, or perhaps a wacky chevron print in rainbow colours, it wouldn't give it that vintage look. But if you go for a solid colour, or if you go for a stripe, these stripes are also really classic looking, that will definitely give it the vintage edge. And the same with these. if I chose you know, like an animal print or something like that, it wouldn't look as vintage. But if I chose a solid black or navy, that's going to look much more in keeping with a vintage outfit. I feel like I've said vintage about 20 million times already. I'm sorry, it's not the end yet. I will be saying it more. Another thing to do is to look at the extra details on a pattern and perhaps remove or add them. So for instance, this pattern, which is By Hand London, by the company By Hand London, it's the Charlotte skirt, is just a simple pencil skirt, but they have styled it here with a peplum. Now, obviously, in the 1940s and 1950s, when people were wearing pencil skirts, they weren't wearing them with a peplum. But you can see that shape and you can think, okay, well, actually, I can use that, but just minus the peplum. So it's about using your initiative a little bit. Another thing you can do is use haberdashery. So my favourite thing at the moment is rickrack. I love it. And that is very in keeping with particularly 1950s and even 60s as well, really. Just jazzing up a plain skirt can give it just that little extra vintage edge if you give the finishing touches a bit of thought. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that I don't make all of my vintage clothes. I do like some of the reproduction companies and the things that they make. And for instance, cardigans, I don't knit, but online companies that sell vintage reproduction clothes actually have some amazing sales, and you can pick up those key pieces like cardigans that will go with a lot of outfits for a really reasonable amount. For instance, this particular one that I'm inserting a picture of now, I purchased from Collective in their Spitalfield store, although it was available online as well. It had been reduced from £45 down to £11. So I couldn't have bought the pattern for that price, let alone then going out and buying the fabric. Now obviously I will be buying a cardigan pattern in the future, but you can see where I'm coming from. There are some things that sometimes it's just not worth making them, because you could get something absolutely perfect, exactly what you want, that will work with lots of your outfits, and it's worth spending the money. So again, just give that a bit of thought when you're planning your outfits and searching out for the perfect sewing pattern, and that you don't always have to sew everything. Some things can be bought. That is all from me today. I hope that these suggestions have helped you in knowing how to source patterns and create outfits with a vintage edge. And I will be back soon with a tutorial on how to create your own vintage style half circle skirt, which would be perfect with a little petticoat underneath. So stay subscribed for that, and you will get a notification when that's gone online next week. And in the meantime, happy sewing everyone. Bye.